Okay, I have for you this morning, to begin, an old Mennonite joke. Okay, I was born and raised in a Mennonite church, so this joke has probably been told in different ways in which it was a Baptist joke, or a Presbyterian joke, or even maybe a Lutheran joke, but this, in my version, is a Mennonite joke. I watered it down a little bit for this gathering, but it goes something like this. Why are Mennonites so against smoking and drinking? Because it might lead to dancing. Now, the point of this joke, and obviously it's not a very good one if I have to tell you the point, is that sometimes we get so caught up in something that we determine to be bad that we overlook the real issue in front of us. Why Mennonites were so against dancing, they got their reasons. I didn't follow that rule when I was growing up in a Mennonite church. But we could all tell this joke about something else in our life or our religious traditions. Because we all have things, practices or traditions that we hold on to, very important to us, but at the same time we'll hold on to them at the expense of overlooking something that is real, that's really important, that's right in front of us. We do that in a variety of ways. Now, the issue at hand from our Gospel of Mark this morning is the lack of ceremonial washing of the hands by the disciples of Jesus before they eat. And the Pharisees and the scribes, as often, they're all worked up about this issue. Now, of course, the point that Jesus makes in all of this has nothing to do with the right or the wrong way to wash your hands, but rather for us to look at what we do and hold as important in the act of living together faithfully with each other throughout all times and journeys of our life. We could all name all sorts of things in our life of faith together that relate to this, couldn't we? These human traditions that we have in place so high of importance. Human traditions around faith practice and community, around worship, around prayer and sharing scripture and devotions, and around meals that we eat together, and around things like ushering or communion practices, and whether we stand or whether we sit, and where we sit in our pews, and Sunday school and confirmation, and all these things, these human traditions that we gather around in our practice of life and faith together. And too many times we have made the mistake of thinking that if we do one of these things wrong, then somehow we are not being faithful, or that our growth in our faith will suffer. Or sometimes we just face the rebuke of someone else who reminds us that we're doing it wrong and being reprimanded. And then that experience of that reprimand keeps us from joining fully into our community of faith. Many times I know we'll ask folks to do things around the life of a faith community of our church. And often, sometimes we hear a response of, well, I don't know if I'll do it right. Because too many times we've been on the other end of being told we did something wrong. And it keeps us from fully engaging and seeking to deepen our relationship with God, each other, and creation. It is those washing hands experiences that sometimes push us away from Jesus, even surrounded by a community of faith. It's happened to all of us. And we've all done it, and I have as well. This past week has been exhausting. I do think that floods, more than any other type of natural disaster, just take everything from us. The power of uncontrolled water and its aftermath overwhelm us. And even if we're not directly affected, we see the devastation of our neighbors and our beloved communities, and we just feel helpless. So please, again, please do what you can as you are able. if you can help out directly in helping to clean or to pick up or to rebuild, if you can donate money or needed items, if you can stand beside someone who's lost everything and be with them in their grief and their pain, praying for them, feeding for them, all of these things that we do together helps us to get through this devastation. But it does exhaust us all, emotionally and physically. This past week, our family, Pastor Julie and my family, we have been going through and walking through the exhausting work of grief. Our sister-in-law, Gretchen, died last Saturday down in Seneca, Wisconsin. And not only do we grieve in losing her from our lives, but we grieve for Pastor Julie's brother, Brad and Gretchen's kids, Zach and Jen. We have all walked this dark valley of death with one another. All of us have at one point in our lives, with our beloved family, our beloved friends when they die, and it just exhausts us. And there are, of course, many other tragedies and struggles of life that have a similar effect, aren't there? The aftermath of trauma of any sort is often overwhelming. One thing I've noticed different in this flood than in previous major flooding events of past years is the power of social media in this flood, of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all those places. And it's wonderful in how we can connect people who need help to people who can give help. But also the overwhelming amount of pictures and stories, just it overwhelms us. And I know I have had to intentionally take a break from that sometimes. Otherwise, you can just get caught up in it. Now, one thing that experiencing trauma in life does, whether it's grief or flooding or whatever the case may be, is it helps us to focus on what is important in life and what it isn't. In our gospel text today, Jesus talks about these human traditions that keep us from fully engaging with God. Now, when human traditions help us connect the important things in life, that is good. And they help us with these difficult questions of life, the rituals that we have with each other, whether it's around worship or family or community. For example, when material goods and physical structures are washed away by the power of water, we often stand in the aftermath and we have to face the question, what do I value in life? And often we center around some combination of family and faith and friends and community and the support we have in one another. And we give just intense thanks that no lives were lost in this flood because it was so close with some people. When a loved one dies, we stand at the grave and we're faced with the finite experience of earthly human life, and we have to face the question, what is the meaning of my experience of life? And we stand in the midst of any trauma, we often ask, how, God, is this possible? In one way or another, we often ask that question. Now, we have many beloved human traditions that help us in discovering the spiritual answers to those big questions. And human faith traditions that are so helpful are things like communal singing. Whether we sing well or not, when we join in, it is so helpful. Prayer with and for one another. Sacrament and a proclamation of Scripture help us find our way through the difficult questions and experiences of life. But we also have to admit that we have some human faith traditions and strong opinions that are not helpful. Things like making a big deal about what pew we sit in, or whether we stand or whether we sit. And yes, Pastor Julie and I discuss, will we stand or will we sit for these parts of the service, because we know it's real. Or things like, whether do we set coffee on the tables when we eat together, or do we put it in the buffet line so people can grab it as they come through? And for some people, that's a deeply important issue. But sometimes we make too big of a deal of these certain traditions, and they limit our understanding of the question, how, God, is this possible in the midst of trauma of our life? Somehow, even though we're brought up in the proclamation of faith and taught that all are saved by the grace of God, somehow in the absence of struggle, we often resort to judgment and qualifiers of grace that sound as ridiculous as the Pharisees making a big deal of the proper washing of hands when the people who are eating food are so desperately hungry. And we do that in a lot of ways with each other. So, my friends, Jesus is reminding us today to seek out what is important in our practice of faith with each other. Jesus is telling us to let go of those things that limit our relationship to God and each other, even if we've always done it that way before. Jesus is telling us we are loved not for how we do things, but rather what and why we do it. I just got done reading a book by Chris Cleave, is the author's name. The book is called Everyone Brave is Forgiven. It's a novel that takes place during World War II in London, England, during the years of 1940 and 1941, before the United States entered World War II. Taking place during the intense bombing of London by German forces and German bombers. One of the main characters, her name is Mary, who lives in London, and she has taken some children of color into her care whose parents have been killed in the bombing and are abandoned to the city. During this time, all the children of London were removed from the city and moved out to neighboring towns in the countryside to protect them from the bombing. But oftentimes, kids of color, kids who were handicapped, or whatever was deemed not normal in 1940 England, were not welcomed or accepted. And so they were forced to stay in the city. And when some of their families were killed, they were in desperate situations. So here is Mary trying to care for and teach some of these children. And in one part of the story, doing this in the chaos of war and nightly bombing raids. You can just imagine what that must have been like. In one part of the story, Mary, and she is with Zachary. Zachary is an African-American boy whose family moved to London from America a few years before the war. Mary and Zachary are walking down the street, and I want to read a short portion of this book for you. Zachary and Mary walked with arms linked while the people they passed looked knives at them. Mary made sure to smile back brightly. It was simply a peculiarity of the British that they could be so stoical about 250 nights of bombing, while the sight of her with a Negro child offended their sensibilities unbearably. We all have our washing of hands traditions and beliefs. And many of them over the years have been incredibly harmful. But in spite of them, the love and grace of Christ washes over us, not with a destruction of flood, but rather with the hope and love of Mary and Zachary walking down the street in the midst of overwhelming racism of 1940 in war-torn London. Christ is telling us today, telling you that you are loved not for how well or right you do something, but rather you are loved for what is in your heart and what God has placed in your journey. So be bold in that grace. Be honest in your own traditions that take us away from each other. Be brave and courageous in showing mercy to those caught up in the aftermath of flood and grief and trauma of life. That is how we are called to be with and for one another. Thanks be to God. Amen.